Hi, welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for part 2 of the Civil War. In our previous lesson, we looked at the opening shots of the Civil War at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, and we discussed the advantages and disadvantages of the northern and southern states, how reality set in following the first engagement of the war, the Battle of Bull Run, and that this would not be the short war that both sides had hoped for. We also learned about the Anaconda plan implemented by the North to surround and suffocate the South. And we will pick up today by looking at how both sides would mobilize for an all-out war and some of the major events that would change the course of this conflict. And just a reminder, teachers at this PowerPoint with a wide variety of resources are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. As we stated, following the first Battle of Bull Run and the Peninsula Campaign in Virginia of 1862, both sides mobilized their societies and economies in what would become this massive conflict. As stated before, the Union Anaconda plan called for a complete naval blockade of the more than 3,500 miles of southern coastline, an almost impossible task. The Union would need to greatly increase the size of its small navy, but fortunately, unlike the South, had the manufacturing ability to do so. The South pleaded with British merchants for desperately needed supplies. Southern blockade running was highly profitable as goods became scarce, but the British government agreed to recognize the Union blockade. This didn't stop British merchants from trying to run through it. The Union blockade faced a serious threat when Southerners had captured and reconditioned a former wooden U.S. warship with iron sides from a U.S. fort in Norfolk, Virginia. Originally named the Merrimack, the Confederacy rechristened her the Virginia. The rebuilt Merrimack quickly destroyed 2 Union wooden ships, leading to one of the most famous battles of the Civil War, when a hastily built Union quote-unquote ironclad, the Monitor, arrived to confront the Merrimack. On March 9th, 1862, the 2 ships faced off against each other in what is known as the Battle of the Monitor and Merrimack, or the Battle of Hampton Roads. Although the battle was largely a draw, it marked a turning point in the production of outdated wooden ships. The Confederates ultimately destroyed the Merrimack to keep it out of the advancing Union troops' hands, and despite their brief excitement, their lack of manufacturing made it impossible for the South to reproduce ironclad blockade runners, in effect giving the North a monopoly on ironclad ships. Meanwhile, on land, the South had won another victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run. An emboldened General Robert E. Lee decided to advance into Union territory by entering Maryland. Feeling pressured, Lincoln put the beloved but criticized General George McClellan back in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Lee and his troops thought that they would be welcomed into the slave state of Maryland, but did not receive the reception that they had hoped for. On September 17, 1862, the 2 armies faced off in the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day in U.S. history, with 22,000 casualties. Although the battle could be seen as a draw, McClellan had stopped Lee's advance, who withdrew to Virginia. However, a draw was not enough to save McClellan's job, as he had twice the number of soldiers as Lee. The quote-unquote victory for the North would have a massive impact on the course of the war. It allowed Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which called for freeing the slaves in the rebellious territories of the Confederacy. Abolitionists and radical Republicans, those who favored freeing the slaves, had been calling on Lincoln to make this a contest over slavery. Lincoln, who hated slavery but worried about keeping the border states in the Union, now felt that a proclamation would not be viewed as a desperate tactic from a commander-in-chief that was losing the war. The Constitution did not give Lincoln the power to end slavery, but his wartime powers did allow him to confiscate an enemy's property, which was the legal status of slaves at the time. Slaves could be considered, quote-unquote, contraband, used by the enemy to further their war efforts. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln announced that he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation to go into effect on January 1, 1863. The proclamation declared, quote-unquote, forever free only slaves located in slave states still in rebellion. Therefore, it did not free slaves in the border states or areas already conquered by Union forces, leaving around 800,000 slaves in bondage. The Emancipation Proclamation, however, had a drastic effect on the war. For starters, England and France, who had both outlawed slavery, could no longer morally consider aiding the South. The North had gained the moral upper hand. Abolitionists and radical Republicans praised Lincoln's call for emancipation. Southern slaves rejoiced and fled to Union lines, further diminishing the Southern plantations' ability to produce desperately needed provisions. By the end of the war, more than 500,000 slaves would run away from their masters. However, not everyone in the North celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation. Northern Democrats exclaimed the executive order was unconstitutional. Ultimately, it would take the 13th Amendment to formally end slavery, which we'll talk about later. However, the Emancipation Proclamation put the institution of slavery firmly on the path towards extinction. As Lincoln's commitment to freeing the slaves had reached a turning point in the war, he now called for the enlistment of black soldiers who had been refused by the Union Army. Famed abolitionist and author Frederick Douglass went on a recruiting campaign of the northern states. Massachusetts created the first all-black regiment, the 54th Infantry, as portrayed in the great movie Glory. By the war's end, close to 180,000 blacks served in the Union Army, most of whom came from southern states. While first relegated to secondary roles in the Army, blacks played a pivotal part in helping to turn the tide in the North's favor. The sight of blacks in uniform outraged many Southerners. Captured black soldiers were often put to death, as demonstrated by the Fort Pillow Massacre in 1864, in which 300 African-American soldiers were killed after they had surrendered, unlike their white Union counterparts. Southerners couldn't bring themselves to use slaves as soldiers. Fear of slave insurrection still gripped the South, and arming them seemed to many extremely dangerous. However, slaves were forced to build fortifications and provide supplies for the Confederate Army. Many would sabotage these efforts, providing aid to the Union in any way they could. And other slaves refused to work at a time when their labor was crucial, while many of their masters were either forced to flee or were off fighting for the Confederacy. Meanwhile, despite his failed first attempt at taking the war to the North in the Battle of Antietam, Lee made another attempt after 2 victories in Virginia with the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. In the summer of 1863, General Lee marched his army north into Pennsylvania. General Lee hoped that his daring plan might embolden the anti-war Northern Democrats, known as Copperheads, to press for peace. He also held out hope that Europeans still might intervene. The Copperheads were extreme Democratic Republicans who called for an immediate end to the war, which they blamed on abolitionists and radical Republicans. The Union Army of the Potomac was now led by General George Meade, who followed in the failed footsteps of Generals McClellan, Burnside, and Hooker. On July 1st, 1863, the Union forces sent out to meet Lee collided with the Confederates on the outskirts of the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Meade managed to set up his forces on a ridge overlooking the valley around Gettysburg. For 3 harrowing days, Lee's 75,000 troops tried to dislodge Meade's 105,000 men from the high ground in vicious attacks and counterattacks to capture strongholds such as Little Round Top, Cemetery Hill, and Devil's Den. On the 3rd day, Lee ordered 15,000 men under the command of General George Pickett to cross an open field under heavy barrage of Union artillery. Known as Pickett's Charge, the devastating losses forced Lee to ultimately retreat. Gettysburg became the most famous battle of the Civil War and represented the largest number of casualties of the entire war, close to 50,000 dead, wounded, or missing. It's also seen as another turning point in the war. The South would never venture north again, and the tide of the war had seemed to turn in the North's favor. And this is where we will pick up next time. But before we do, let's review. In order to limit the South's access to supplies, the Union implemented a naval blockade. What were the names of the two quote-unquote ironclads that battled off the coast of Virginia? The Merrimack versus the Monitor. This battle in Maryland resulted from Lee's first attempt to go on the offensive. Antietam. What was Lincoln able to release following the victory at the Battle of Antietam? The Emancipation Proclamation. What impact did the Emancipation Proclamation have on the war? Well, it gave the Union a cause to fight for and the quote-unquote moral high ground. It discouraged England and France from providing aid to the South, and it opened the door for African American soldiers to join the Union Army. Did the Emancipation Proclamation free all the slaves? No, it didn't free slaves in the border states or in conquered lands by Union forces. This event showed black soldiers the danger of surrendering. The Fort Pillow Massacre. These extreme Northern Democrats called for an immediate end to the war. The Copperheads. What battle resulted from Lee's second attempt to take the war to the North? Gettysburg. What was the impact of the Battle of Gettysburg? Well, the South would never go on the offensive again, and the tide had seemed to swing into the North's favor. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe because up next is our Civil War Part 3. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with worksheets, quizzes, Kahoots, guided notes for flipped class videos, smartboard activities, lesson plans, and additional activities are all available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. Again, guys, thanks for watching. Keep up that good work.